everyone, welcome back to this. I'm going to be making the hero's bow? I don't know what it's called, maybe it's called the Great Eagle bow. Making the Great Eagle bow from Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. I've not played it. I just really like the Breath of the Wild props, so I'm going to make them. So you're going to start off the same as we normally do, drawing a paper pattern out. It's really just freehand sketching, so I just did it by pulling up a reference picture online and then sketching out half of the bow on a folded out piece of paper because it's symmetrical, so you only need to draw half of it to make it even, which is great. Then you want to cut the big piece into 3 pieces. You want to cut out the handle bit from the middle, so this bit right here. You want to kind of cut that out, so you've got these 2 actual main bow sections separate to this. And then using those patterns you want to cut out 1 of the handle and 2 of the bow pieces onto EVA foam. And you want to kind of flip the pattern as you're cutting the bow pieces so that you have like 1 for each side, so they're like mirrored, I guess. When you go back to the bow piece and you want to cut off the smaller section, so like here, you want to cut off this little wing, so you just have the wing section and then the bow without that little bit. It's really hard to explain. And then you want to cut out another 2 pieces just of the big piece again in the same way, so flipping it so that it mirrors. This is just so that when you glue them together it'll have the kind of like lowered effect on this bit, so this bit's a little bit thinner. Also, do you like how my bow, this bit broke when I was taking pictures of it yesterday, so it's just wobbling about. That's good, isn't it? The handle piece should be cut a little bit bigger than the pattern, so it has space to overlap onto the bow main structure piece. You want to mark out the overlap onto the pieces and then kind of cut in, like carve out a section for that overlap so that when it's glued on it looks nice and flat. Then glue the handle piece and 2 of the bigger pieces together so they kind of make one side of the structure. Move on to the interior structure. I had the worst time ever with the interior structure. I hated it. Obviously it doesn't support itself, so it needs something in between. And because it's got joints, like corners here that need the piece to have like a joint in it, the joints made it really weak and they'd just flop and nothing worked. I ended up going with a big piece of foam board cut out to the general shape of the bow, all out of 1 piece of foam board, so I had to buy one of those massive sheets. And I just hot glue loads of wire over it to make it a bit stronger. And that worked well enough. It's not perfect, but it's the best I could do. You've made the structure, you can kind of carve out a little bit from the inside of the bow, just like you did for the handle, like a bit that will fit the interior structure. And you can carve that in so it's nice and flat and then just hot glue it in. Use loads of hot glue so it's nice and secure. Before you glue the rest of it together we're going to move on to these little decorative bits, the bits that stick out. So these are really simple. I just rolled a piece of paper really tightly into a big old tube like that and just kept adding pieces of paper until it was the thickness that I wanted and cut it down to the size that I want. And then I also glued a cocktail stick into the centre, so I glued it so it was half of it was inside and half of it was sticking out, so you could stick that exposed cocktail stick into the middle for a bit of structure. And for anything that had little details on the end, these are just bits of craft foam that I glued on, and this is just a piece of EVA foam that I glued on with a cocktail stick in the middle, again for a bit more support. So for the string of the bow, I wanted to be able to attach it later because I thought if I attached it first, if I glued it actually into the bow it would get really in the way when I was trying to make things, or it would break and I wouldn't be able to change it, or I'd want to change the material and I wouldn't be able to do that. So to avoid all of those things I just made 2 little loops out of wire and I glued them into the actual bow instead of the string so that I could just tie the string onto the hooks whenever I was ready. At this point, just make the little loop. I just use gardening wire and just curled them up a little bit with some pliers. Now you can take the other EVA piece of the bow section and start gluing that on top so it covers up all the interior structure and you get the main structure done. My advice is just to go really slowly with this. Just glue one little tiny section at a time so you can make sure you're getting it lined up as neatly as possible. You want to just leave a little space unglued wherever you want the hooks to be, probably right towards the end of the bow. And then you just want to push those in and use loads of hot glue to secure them in. When everything is glued in, you can also push the cocktail sticks into the gap, the EVA foam. It's really easy to push the cocktail sticks into the EVA foam, they go in really nicely, and then just use loads of hot glue to secure them. So you're going to focus on these little bits around the handle next. So I just cut 4 triangles out of EVA foam that were the same size as the little tips that I wanted to have on these bits. So I cut them down, making sure the angle was right for each one, and then I just hot glued them on to the sides. For now, that's all we're going to do for that bit, and then we're going to move on to dremeling the bow. So you're just going to use, well, I just used a Dremel to just sand down all the edges, make them nice and curved. While I was dremeling, I also went over these little points on the bow. I kind of used the Dremel to sink them in just a tiny little bit and make the little sunken bits on the top. I just cut 4 pieces of craft foam in a kind of eye shape that would cover the 2 triangles that I've just stuck on and the bit in between, just to neaten them up. It's just kind of trial and error cutting the shape out right. You can use tracing paper over it to make it a bit easier to find the pattern. Cut 4 of those out and I glued one over both sides, just using it so it covered up all the seams and made it a lot neater. And then I cut the same shape out a little bit smaller and thinner and I glued that on right here with a little bit poking out over the top. So I did that on each side and then just pinched the tops together and put a bit of hot glue down there so they kind of had that tapered shape to them. Just take into account these decorative bits when you're making the pattern, because I didn't, and my handle ended up a tiny bit small. One side of the handle is probably still exposed at this point, and I didn't want to put another piece of EVA over the top because I thought that would make it too thick. I just used wall filler to fill in the handle bit and make it a lot more even, and then once that was dry I just glued more craft foam over the top to neaten it all off. First you want to prime it. I always use gesso to prime my things. I do quite a few coats of primer just to make sure that the white is really bold. I did about 3 coats, I think. So once all the primer was dry I then painted the whole thing in an off-white colour because some of the details on the bow are like this off-white colour, so I wanted that to be on the base. Once everything was dry I went over and marked on all the little details, the white details over here. I just freehanded all this with a pencil on each side, and you could probably use a stencil if you wanted to, and then mark out where these gold bits are going to start and end as well. After I've done that I just went in with the black greyish paint and just painted really carefully around all the sections. So basically just painted avoiding all the bits that I'd marked on, like a really intense colouring in. It's really just about taking your time and being really careful, using a really small brush and not rushing. Just trying to keep everything as neat as possible, and it does work out, you just have to be really patient with it. At this point just went over and painted all the gold bits in that colour and the grey bits grey, and then there's a few red bits that I went on and painted them as well. So I added a little bit of shading to that. I added some black around the edges of the bow and a little bit of dark and light highlights and shadows on the gold bits. I found it really difficult to shade this prop because thin props are always hard to shade because they always look really crowded, especially when they've got so much detail on these bits, because you don't want to touch the detail, you don't want to shade over the details. You just want to go and rub out all the pencil lines that are left on your bow. So just get rid of any of the pencil lines that are left over, and if there's any bits that you feel like you want to be a bit neater, you can go over them again with a bit of white paint just to clean them up. And that's it! It's done! Look at it! was something that was suggested by someone in the comments of one of my other videos, so if you have any suggestions of something I could make sure to leave them because I might make it. Thank you for watching. I have all my social media in the description. You can follow me if you want. Maybe subscribe, watch some of the other videos, that's cool, that's a fun thing to do on your afternoon. Thank you very much, thanks, bye!